climate equity framework that is part of the legislation that kicked off the implementation of the roadmap. So in the 2019 legislative session, Colorado adopted 14 different bills that in one way or another work to address the climate crisis. And one of those was House Bill 1261, which put in place a 26% reduction by 2025, all the way out to a 90% reduction by 2050 set of climate reduction targets, and directed the Department of Public Health to look at disproportionately impacted communities across the state. And in working through that legislation, the team at CDPHE and the team working on the roadmap really began to develop this climate equity framework with these goals. And it started with putting together a group of individuals and organizations from frontline and impacted communities to help us really build a tool that will further identify who those communities are and what risks they're facing. As part of that commitment, we're really working on trying to change the way state agencies do outreach to impacted communities, provide engagement opportunities to impacted communities, and to try and really make it easier to participate in this process. And I think one thing, I will highlight, I've been now in state government for something like 12 years and been part of public hearings often during that process. And I've never seen the kind of levels of participation in the past that we were able to get this year when we did a public outreach session on the roadmap. We did one early fall and one in October, and each of them had roughly 300 people joining us over a Zoom call. And if we had held those in a room in Denver, we really wouldn't have been able to have folks participate. We were also able to do a simultaneous translation of those events into Spanish. And so I think those are just a couple of the ways that we are able to try and increase access to the process. And I should also say that we did those in the evening from 5 to 8 o'clock, and we're able to get state staff and directors of state agencies there to participate in an after work hour session. As part of the climate equity framework and part of what's built into the roadmap is a commitment to look at the different policies and to assess the different policies, not just on a statewide level, but really to try and focus in on those impacted communities and what those policies mean for those impacted communities. And of course, as we start talking about policies and go through questions, that may look very different if we're talking about transportation policy versus waste policy versus, coal plant retirement or gas plant policies, but really trying to take the tools that the Department of Public Health and Environment is working on and building to ensure that we're looking at those impacts on historically and disproportionately impacted communities. So I've referenced a couple of times the timeline. It really started in May of 2019 with that passage of legislation. Through the fall of 2019, the state went through a procurement process and looked at a number of different contractors, and then ultimately hired an organization called Energy and Environmental Economics, which is a national level consulting firm that has done this kind of emissions roadmap work for a number of states, including California and New York, as well as utilities, including Xcel Energy up in Minnesota. And so in late 2019 and early 2020, the state agency staff worked with E3 to gather as much of the data as we could that was in EPA's state implementation tool, available from different state agencies like CDOT and Department of Natural Resources, with the intention of really trying to recast the state's 2005 greenhouse gas emissions baseline that all of the emissions reduction targets would be sent to. Through the spring and summer, we continued to work on and refine the modeling assumptions and the modeling tool. Of course, during that process, we had hoped to be farther along, and then, the COVID pandemic hit, and part of the public feedback we were getting was really a series of questions, around, are you taking account of the impacts of COVID on the modeling? And so we stepped back with E3 and said, how do we do that? What would it look like to recast that modeling? And we were able to determine a couple of key variables that might be impacted by COVID, would be impacted by COVID, and that we could tweak within the assumptions to essentially turn out a sensitivity analysis, and I've got some of that in here. In September, we released a public comment draft and had a month-long public comment process that closed actually in early part of November, so it's closer to 6 weeks. And since then, we've been going through the comments that we've received and looking at how we can be responsive within the roadmap, and in instances where we may not be able to be responsive in the roadmap, also working on an additional document, a question and answer type document that will be uploaded to the web page that hosts the roadmap. I should say that all of those public comments we've received throughout the process are available from the Energy Office website that hosts the roadmap, as are the draft documents and all of the technical supporting materials. So all of the modeling inputs and assumptions are downloadable in spreadsheets for anyone to go ahead and look at and utilize. And then the roadmap, the intention right now is to release it in early 2021 as a final document available for download from the website. And again, we'll have all of that final data and set of input assumptions available then. Just a snapshot of sort of the process we've gone through in terms of outreach to different groups during the year we've been working on this. We've done targeted meetings with different industry sectors, mining, oil and gas, outdoor recreation. We've presented regularly from roughly February through October to the Air Quality Control Commission, during which there was public feedback that was provided. We've met with the Transportation Commission and local governments. We've really tried to have an open and thorough process to take feedback on this. As well, we had a technical advisory group of experts across Colorado, and they were working with us from the start to help define what modeling changes we might want to make or need to make to the 2005 baseline, and helping us work through typical data issues that one would have to work through in the modeling. So getting then to the where are we and what have we learned part of this. What's interesting is that the 4 largest sources of emissions in 2005 are exactly the same as they are in 2020. Although what's interesting is they've changed in rank order. So in 2019, transportation became the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in Colorado, followed by electric power, oil and gas, and buildings. And what I will say is for those bottom 3 there in 2020, there's really not a huge amount of difference across them. And so one thing we know is we really need to get to emissions reductions across all 4 of those different sectors. So as we think about what we need to do, it's also worth just taking a step back and thinking about what we as a state are already doing and have done. So part of what was passed in the 2019 legislative session was a bill that requires Xcel Energy to file a clean energy plan before the Public Utilities Commission that will hit an 80% emissions reduction by 2030. So that's ahead of the statewide goal of a 50% reduction, but something that we feel is necessary if the state as a whole is to get to the 50%. That legislation provided a pathway for any other utility in the state to opt into filing a clean energy plan. And right now it looks like All of the state's largest utilities intend to take that pathway and have committed to at least an 80% emissions reduction by 2030. Platte River Power Authority actually was getting to a 90% reduction. We also have a greenhouse gas reporting rule that was put in place and will track and report different sector emissions going forward. In the transportation space, we've passed a different range of EV policies. The Air Quality Control Commission is, as you probably all know, adopted the zero emission vehicle standard. We also passed legislation that requires Xcel and Black Hills to file transportation electrification plans that would support EV adoption in Colorado, and actually next week the Public Utilities Commission will vote on a $130 million plan that Xcel has brought forward that will provide incentives and support for EV infrastructure as well as rebates for electric vehicles. Don't know what yet the commission will approve within that, but we're cautiously optimistic that they will approve the full suite of packages. We're working heavily on building codes and appliance efficiency as well. Part of the recent work on codes is a requirement that any jurisdiction in the state that has a code have one of the 3 most recent set of building codes. And then recently also passed HFC rules and working through oil and gas reforms at the COGCC. So that's what we've been doing. A quick snapshot as well of the proposed coal plant retirement schedules, and I know some of this has been in the media and been debated recently at the Air Commission in terms of the dates for the Rawhide, Nixon, and Craig units down there on the bottom. So this is a snapshot then of the different scenarios that we modeled within the roadmap. And the blue line at the top that you see is essentially where our emissions trajectory might have been or would have been absent policy action in 2019 and on. We then asked E3 to model a scenario that looked at the impacts of that aggressive 2019 legislative session where we had 14 bills, as well as additional administrative actions and some of the voluntary commitments like Tri-State's commitment to a responsible energy plan that retires all of their coal-fired units by 2030. And that's that gold line in the middle. Underneath that is the COVID impact modeling. And then the third line on the bottom is a scenario that we asked E3 to build out that provides one possible pathway to meeting each of the 3 emissions reduction targets in the state. And that's what we're terming the 1261 targets scenario. So it's an illustrative pathway that gets us down there. So what fills in sort of the gap between that blue line on the top and the golden line and then ultimately the red line? So this is the stack or a stack of potential emissions reductions through different sectors out to 2030. And you know what's clear to us from the modeling is that clean energy and the clean energy transition is going to be a key part of how we meet the emissions reduction goals. Once we get closer to that 80% by 2030 number, then we really look at things like vehicle electrification and electrification in the built environment. So transitioning space heating and water heating where it's economic onto that cleaner grid. Coupled with additional building and industrial efficiency. And then you can see there's a large brown wedge there that is additional oil and gas measures that we need to take. So leak detection and mitigation being a big part of that. There's also within there work in waste, industrial carbon capture and sequestration. So with that as background, we then in the roadmap kind of bucketed this into a set of 5 different opportunities to help make the transition to a decarbonizing economy in Colorado. And we looked at it in terms of energy efficiency, changing the way we use energy, as well as electrification. Then also looked at changing energy supply, both in the electric sector and the transportation sector. And then finally, non-combustion emissions, and that's really things in the oil and gas sector, some industrial process, and then ag and natural working lands as well. So where are we going? Well, I've talked a little bit about clean energy plans already. Right now, Tri-State has filed a Tri-State Generation and Transmission, which is a G&T that serves a number of co-ops here in Colorado, has filed its resource plan with the Public Utilities Commission. They opted not to file a clean energy plan, but they did file a resource plan that meets the 80% emissions reduction. XL Energy, the state's largest utility, will file its resource plan and clean energy plan in the end of March this year. And then we think that Holy Cross and potentially Colorado Springs and Platte River will also each file clean energy plans at some point this spring. My office over the last year, in coordination with the work done in the roadmap, did an assessment of the potential for building electrification here in Colorado, and so looked at, what was the unconstrained sort of technical potential all the way down to two different looks at economic potential and implementation, really based on different policy scenarios and how aggressive the state might be willing to be to push building electrification. And so one of the things that we'll be focused on in the coming legislative session is some additional building electrification policy, and I will talk more about that in a second. Coupled with electrification as a pathway to reduce emissions in buildings, we really are intending to focus on expanding and modernizing gas utility efficiency programs. Right now in Colorado, the way our investor-owned utilities do gas efficiency, it's based on a spending requirement to spend a certain percentage of their revenues, and then the savings flow from that revenue number. And when we look at both the success of what we've been able to do here in the electric efficiency side and best practices for gas efficiency planning across the country, a better model and approach would be to allow state regulators, the Public Utilities Commission, to set a gas efficiency target and then look at the maximizing the cost-effective efficiency resources to meet that target, and a budget will follow from that. That's what we've been doing here in the electric sector side for the better part of 13 years, and it's been very, very successful for our investor-owned utilities. Third, we're looking at the possibility of a renewable natural gas or a biomethane requirement for the natural gas utilities in the state, and potentially a greenhouse gas target for those utilities. So I've referenced already that there is a pathway for electric utilities to meet an 80% emissions reduction by 2030. The roadmap contemplates the possibility of having a similar kind of target for gas utilities, not at an 80% level, in large part because there aren't readily available cost-effective technologies to help gas utilities transition. On the electricity side, right now, what we and other states are finding is it's often cheaper to turn off an existing coal plant, stop running it, purchase new wind, new solar, and run those facilities. And so you get both cost savings and significant emissions reductions by making that technology swap. And right now, there's not really that alternative on the gas side to make that kind of replacement. And so when we think about, implementing a target for natural gas utilities, it would really be coupled with things like allowing utilities to use renewable natural gas in the gas delivery system, modernizing and expanding energy efficiency or DSM, and then building electrification. All of those really reduce the energy throughput from a gas utility by reducing consumption at the end, or reducing the carbon intensity of the gas in the pipes. I should say it's not the carbon intensity in the pipes, it's the carbon intensity that once it hits the burner tip. My apologies for that. And then we'll continue to work on improving building efficiency through codes and performance standards. So coming into the 2021 legislative session, one of the things that my office is bringing forward as a bill would be a requirement, statewide requirement for all buildings over 50,000 square feet to benchmark their energy use through an online EPA tool, and then roughly in the 2026 timeframe to begin meeting certain performance requirements. And I should say there are some exemptions for buildings, but it would be the vast majority of buildings 50,000 square feet and over would be required to benchmark under that proposal, and then also be required to meet those performance standards. And they would be able to meet those performance standards by working with their local utility to improve energy efficiency, or potentially to transition from gas to electrification within that environment. So that really paints, I think, a picture of what the Energy Office is looking at, not just for the work that comes out of the roadmap for us, but really a picture of our upcoming legislative agenda, with the exception of the clean energy plans, which will be in the regulatory arena. The rest of that really frames out my office's legislative agenda for the coming session. So we've also been working closely with the Department of Transportation to implement a range of policies and to think through a range of policies that would help reduce emissions in transportation, which is, as I said, is now the largest sector of emissions in the state. So we are working heavily on transitioning to zero emission vehicles, and within the light duty vehicle sector, that's really vehicle electrification. So my office is working with a range of EV charging infrastructure providers to build out an EV charging infrastructure network across Colorado, largely using the VW settlement dollars. We are also working with CDOT, which is currently in a stakeholder process around a medium and heavy duty transition to zero emission vehicles, and thinking through what it might mean to look at what California's done in the medium and heavy duty space, and looking at that transition. CDOT is also working to factor emissions and emissions planning into the state's transportation plan, and looking at having that potentially be one of the criteria for how they evaluate different projects that would come forward within the transportation plan. And then a big one is really working to reduce the amount of vehicles traveled. And I think, we are both hopeful and optimistic that we are learning a lot from a forced experiment. In March, none of us plan to be working at home nearly as much as some of us are, but we've seen significant reductions in VMT since the COVID pandemic. And so CDOT and my office are working with business and industry partners to try and figure out how we continue to capture the reductions in driving, so that we can build in the policies that will retain those emissions and air pollution savings. And then the last part of that reduction in VMT is working with the MPOs and working with local governments to figure out different land use strategies, so that we're not building in ways that require people to drive or make it necessary to drive to get done what people want to do, but looking at putting housing closer to jobs and closer to the other things that people want and need in their daily lives. And so, we don't have a clear picture yet of what that ultimate set of strategies might look like, but we're actively engaged in a conversation with different stakeholders to figure out how we might be able to create incentives to change land use planning and tipping it in a way that makes it easier to not have to drive. And then the last big piece of things that I want to talk to is the ag and working land. It is really an important part of meeting the state's overall emissions reduction goals. And so we're looking at trying to create a stream of funding to help implement incentives for soil health practices in the agricultural space. My office runs an agricultural energy efficiency program that helps provide energy audits to farmers and ranchers across Colorado. And actually just recently, as part of our work at the Public Utilities Commission, we reached an agreement with Xcel Energy to form a partnership where Xcel will begin doing a lot of that work with us and for us. And we are optimistic that that will result in even more outreach and additional resources that we can help bring to the table to increase the uptake in energy efficiency programs and renewable energy programs on the state's farms and ranches. The Department of Agriculture is putting together a new set of conservation programs under a new heading and within their office that will allow them to coordinate a number of efforts that previously were disaggregated. And so we're optimistic that that will result in some efficiencies and improvements to the conservation programs. And then looking at supporting the development of carbon markets that would provide additional funding for those soil health practices and provide a revenue stream to support agricultural reductions in emissions. I talked earlier about the COGCC, and I think here I'll just highlight the change in the COGCC rules and around notice process and environmental justice. And I think that comes back to one of the things I started with today, which is a focus within the roadmap and within each of our agencies' efforts on environmental justice and ensuring that the work that we're doing not only reduces emissions, but really works hard to target emissions reductions in historically impacted and heavily impacted communities across the state. So with that, I'll just jump to how to stay engaged. I mean, I did say that we are planning to introduce the roadmap or release it in early January. But one thing that we are all clear about is that that's really the start of the work that we're going to do. And that is, at that point, we begin working through different sets of processes and regulatory arenas, the legislature, and other venues to put those policies in place to ensure that we're making progress to the emissions reductions we need to get to. So if you want to provide feedback, the link to the Energy Office website to the roadmap is up there. There's also an email address, climatechange@state.co.us. And we look forward to any feedback or thoughts that you have on the roadmap or the policies that we're planning to implement. With that, I'm happy to stop and take questions.
All right, let's see. And you guys, if you want to just unmute to ask your questions, it might work out easiest that way.
So there's a great question in the chat, Sarah, that I'm happy to jump in on. So that in case folks aren't seeing it, it asks if we would consider promoting electrification by prohibiting natural gas hookups to new buildings, as some cities in the U.S. Have done. That is not a policy that we're bringing forward in the roadmap at this point in time. I think that we are taking a slightly different approach in trying to promote electrification through the requirement of the state's two investor-owned utilities to bring forward electrification plans, and by working collaboratively with other utilities to implement electrification. A part of that is that, here in Colorado, we have a lot of places where the transition to electrified buildings may be more challenging because of the high altitude and the cold weather climates that we face that some other jurisdictions don't face. And, we're also cognizant of cost of that transition. So I think at this point, we're taking a slightly different approach and not looking to ban natural gas, but certainly trying to create incentives for jurisdictions to not implement gas where it's cost effective not to do that.
Hi, Keith. This is Ginger Fast. You mentioned that next week the commission is going to make a decision about electric vehicles. I was wondering if you know where people go to follow up on that.
I do. So I should say that they will deliberate and that's the Public Utilities Commission. They will deliberate and they will vote on, and I'm putting the link to the PUC website in the chat. They will vote on a range of decision points within that. The decision's not final and official until the written decision is issued, but we will have a very clear picture of what that written decision should look like as a result of those deliberations on the 23rd. And that's the 23rd from, if I can pull up my calendar here, I can tell you. My apologies, I closed that out so I wasn't overflowing the presentation. It's the 23rd from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. And if you go to the Public Utilities Commission website, and there should be a link to view hearings or watch hearings. If you click on that, they will webcast that deliberation from the commissioners.
Thanks, I found it.
I'll have my popcorn for that, I promise.
Janet, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is Janet Keeler, and I'm with the Denver Airport. I'm just curious with, a pending change in administration, and we'll see what happens with Congress. What kinds of federal changes do you think would be significant enough to really re-inform this plan? And how likely are they soon? In other words, are you going to be reopening the plan as soon as the ink is dry? Or do you think it'll be a lot more long-lasting?
Great question. So the plan is really a framework for how to meet the 2025, 2030, and 2050 goals. And it tells us different ways we can get savings we need in order to reach those goals, but it's also intended to be a living document. So when we went through the process of developing the plan with E3, we also purchased all of the modeling tools from E3 and did training for state staff with E3 so that it's something we can continue to update on a going forward basis so that we know we're making the progress we need to make and to be able to course correct. That said, we're also excited about the change in administration and what it might mean for implementing climate policy here in Colorado, as well as at the national level. I think among the things that will probably look different, we're not going to be fighting a vehicle standard and trying to preserve the state zero emission vehicle standard. We anticipate that the Biden-Harris administration will reinstitute, the California ZEV standard and get out of the court case. We think that there'll be a stimulus coming forward that looks at investment in infrastructure and that clean energy will be a big part of that. We don't know exactly what that will mean for Colorado, but we look forward to working with the administration on there. There's likely to be an update to the social cost of carbon, which here in Colorado, electric utilities are required to use a social cost of carbon in their, regulated electric utilities are required to use a social cost of carbon in their resource planning. And so that, while it's not a cost that the utilities pay or customers pay, will have a significant impact on what resources are cost effective in those plans. So those are just a couple of really simple things that the administration can do that will make a big difference for us here on the ground and really help us implement policies that are already part of the roadmap. I think there's a range of things that could happen down the road that, will accelerate the reductions that we see in the roadmap in different sectors. Support for heavy duty vehicle electrification and zero emissions vehicles in that sector, for example, would be a support that would accelerate something we're already looking at in the roadmap.
All right, thank you. Michael Ludlow, do you have a question?
Yes, this is Mike Ludlow. My question is Colorado considering a carbon cap and trade program similar to what California has with the sale of allowances and carbon offsets?
Yeah, great question. And Michael, the answer to that is no. The governor's been really clear that he doesn't think that a state level cap and trade program is a policy path that makes sense for Colorado. We were asked by the governor to think about the possibility of transitioning from taxing income to taxing pollution. And so there is reference to that transition within the roadmap. But in order to do that, there's a fairly sophisticated set of modeling that you would have to do around the current tax and then the transition to a pollution tax to ensure that the state continues to receive revenue and that it's at least, it doesn't harm ordinary Coloradans in some unexpected way. So there's a lot of really sophisticated modeling and tax modeling that we were just not able to do as part of the roadmap process that we'll continue to look at and think through what that transition from taxing income to taxing pollution could look like. And of course, with the Biden-Harris administration, we don't know if there will be a national effort to pursue a carbon tax or a cap and trade program and what those might look like.
All right, any other questions for Keith? Ginger?
Yeah, I had another question. With the retirement of the coal plants, have they identified what fuel sources are going to be replacing that?
So yes and no. So some of the utilities have already gone through the process of adopting resource plans, and those have identified the replacement resources. Others have not. So I'm working from memory here, which is admittedly fallible, so I may have to follow up with you. But from recollection, for Colorado Springs, it's predominantly a combination of wind, solar, and batteries, with a small amount of natural gas backup. And I should say, coming back to that electrification question, Colorado Springs is really among the leaders in the state on that effort to electrify, and they're working with their large home builders and developers down there to try and build out just new all-electric developments so that they aren't hooking up new gas to those. And we're watching that and trying to learn from what Colorado Springs is doing with those builders and developers down there. Platte River Power Authority similarly has predominantly a combination of wind and solar with a small amount of gas for peaking purposes. Tri-State just filed its responsible energy plan with the Public Utilities Commission, and I've not had an opportunity yet to dig through what the resource mix looks like in there. But from recollection, again, they were predominantly wind and solar with a small amount of gas. I think it was a couple 100 megawatts of gas they were looking at for peaking capacity. And then Xcel Energy will file its plan in March, so we don't know what Xcel's new portfolio of resources might look like. Although I would expect it will be similar to the others in that it looks like predominantly wind and solar with some amount of gas.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, any other questions? All right, Keith, thank you again. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Evan. Really appreciate the opportunity. And if you do have additional questions, please feel free to send them to the email climatechange@state.co.us, or you can find my email through Sarah or on the Energy Office website, and happy to provide answers to folks.
All right. Thanks. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.